Before dawn, heat gathered beneath the timbered roofs of the distillery sheds along the East River in New York City. Whiskey had already been drawn from the copper stills during the night. What remained in the vats was a hot, fermented residue of corn and rye known as still-slop, or simply swill. Men shoveled the steaming mass into troughs set before rows of tethered cattle. The arrangement seemed practical. Waste from one trade became feed for another. No pasture interrupted the crowded waterfront. No meadow softened the brick and smoke of lower Manhattan. The cows stood in narrow stalls on floors darkened by manure and damp, their world confined to the length of a chain. Yet still-slop offered little nourishment. Stripped of much of its value during fermentation and distillation, it left the herd weakened over time. Contemporary investigators described swollen joints, infected udders, and ulcerated hides. Some animals grew so frail they were supported by harness while being milked. Their diet and confinement bred illness that did not remain within the shed walls. The milk drawn from these cows was thin and often tinged blue. It lacked the rich color and body associated with pasture-fed herds beyond the city. At times, it carried an odor that hinted at the condition of the animal from which it came. In districts such as Five Points, few families had the means to question what arrived at their door. Immigrant households crowded into tenement rooms where clean water was uncertain and refrigeration unknown. For infants who could not be breastfed, milk was the primary source of nourishment. Vendors moved through the streets at first light, dipping ladles into large cans and filling waiting pitchers. Producers understood that appearance shaped confidence. To counter the bluish cast, they added chalk or plaster of Paris to whiten the liquid. Flour and starch thickened it to resemble cream. Reform accounts from the period alleged that eggs were sometimes mixed in, and in extreme claims even calf brains were used to lend body to the altered brew, correcting color and texture but doing nothing for quality. In rural dairies, milk could be cooled quickly in spring houses or packed in ice. In Manhattan's distillery sheds, it was poured into containers and carried through streets already warming under the sun. Hours might pass before the milk reached a child's cup. In that time, bacteria multiplied. Physicians of the mid-19th century recorded recurring waves of infant illness, particularly in the hottest part of the year. Severe diarrhea, then called summer complaint, swept through crowded wards. Dehydration followed swiftly in small children, and mortality rates rose to alarming levels. Later medical understanding would link contaminated milk supplies to outbreaks of typhoid fever and to the spread of bovine tuberculosis. In New York, the numbers spoke plainly. In some neighborhoods, a third of children died before reaching 5 years of age. The trade persisted because it was immediate and inexpensive. Distillery dairies stood beside the source of their feed. They avoided the cost and delay of transporting milk from rural counties north of the city. Their product reached consumers quickly, and it sold for less. For families living day to day, price carried decisive weight. Political protection strengthened the arrangement. Officials connected to Tammany Hall, the Democratic machine that held firm control over city government, had little incentive to challenge an industry that provided jobs and affordable goods. The Municipal Board of Health possessed limited authority and few inspectors. Chemical analysis of food remained in its infancy. Without clear standards or consistent enforcement, adulteration flourished. In 1858, journalists from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper gained entry to the distillery sheds. Their engravings depicted gaunt cows standing in filth, brewery vats rising behind milking stalls, and workers filling barrels with pale liquid destined for the city's children. Public hearings followed, and dairy operators defended their methods. They maintained that distillery mash was nourishing and that additives posed no harm. Critics countered that a diet of still-slop deprived cattle of essential health and that cosmetic alterations masked the product's decline. Members of the New York Academy of Medicine examined samples and condemned the practice of feeding cows on distillery waste. Their statements lent professional authority to calls for reform. Change arrived gradually. Inspections increased, and some distillery dairies closed under pressure. Soon, rail connections improved, allowing milk from upstate farms to reach New York more reliably. In later decades, pasteurization would become standard, heating milk to destroy harmful microbes before distribution. Bottling practices grew more uniform and regulatory authority expanded. By the end of the 19th century, the phrase "swill milk" had entered public language as a warning. The brewery sheds that once housed cattle faded from Manhattan's shoreline. Refrigerated transport and clearer inspection standards reshaped the dairy trade. In tenement rooms where infants had weakened during the heat of summer, the cost of neglect had been recorded in burial registers and hospital wards. From those records emerged a new civic understanding. The nourishment of the city's children could not be entrusted solely to profit or hidden within industrial walls. Milk appeared ordinary in the cup, pale and familiar. In mid-19th century New York, it carried the imprint of a city learning to regulate its own growth. From fermented grain and altered quartz came an enduring lesson. Progress demanded scrutiny, and the health of a metropolis depended upon vigilance in even the most common provisions.